Why is the United States, the country that has prospered so mightily under the system, tearing it down?
Once, it was the empire of dreams. Its dollar ruled, its military dictated, its influence was law. But power never lasts forever.
In just 1 week, 4 countries made moves that quietly rewired the global balance of power. India ditched the dollar, China weaponized rare earth, the US hit back, and Africa claimed its own voice. All in the same news cycle. It's one pattern, a global system shifting in real time.
It's the story of a world shifting, a financial, political, and ideological realignment unfolding before our eyes.
Trump is matching the rhetoric with military moves in the Caribbean. Will he attack Venezuela?
The president announced an additional 100% tariff on Chinese goods.
Has Donald Trump put India in a diplomatic spot?
Leaders of 3 of the world's most powerful countries have been meeting in China.
As Jaishankar said, BRICS must reinforce the peace building.
Iran's foreign minister stated that the resolution has definitely expired.
Once, America stood unchallenged, a superpower that dictated the global order.
We believe in work for the unemployed. We believe in saving homes. Cross our hearts and hope to die. We believe in all these things.
Its dollar was the bloodline of the world economy, and its voice echoed in every major decision made by global institutions. But as the 21st century unfolds, that dominance is being quietly and effectively questioned. In 2006, 5 nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, came together to form what would later be known as BRICS. At first glance, it appeared to be just another economic partnership. But beneath that, a far greater ambition was brewing: creation of a multipolar world. For decades, institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and G7 have been dominated by Western powers, especially the United States. Their policies, loans, and aid often came with conditions that extended Western influence. BRICS was designed to break that pattern, to give developing nations a voice, to establish independence from Washington's control. And that is precisely why the United States fears it.
President-elect Trump is vowing to impose 100% tariffs on BRICS nations unless they commit to not developing a new currency. Trump made the declaration in a Truth Social post Saturday saying, quote, "There is no chance that the BRICS will replace the US dollar in international trade, and any country that tries should wave goodbye to America."
The US sees BRICS not as a trade alliance, but as a geopolitical counterweight, a direct challenge to its hegemony. Russia and China, both strategic adversaries, are using BRICS as a diplomatic shield, a stage to rally developing nations against US dominance. For Washington, BRICS represents an ideological rebellion, nations refusing to play by American rules. From energy markets to technology, from finance to foreign policy, BRICS is slowly building an alternative network, one that doesn't revolve around the US dollar, NATO influence, or Western approval. And the expansion of BRICS not only deepens that concern, with countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt showing interest or joining the bloc. The US now sees BRICS as more than a talking point. It's a movement towards a new world balance that could permanently weaken America's role as a global leader. At the heart of Washington's anxiety lies a single word: de-dollarization. Since World War II, the US dollar has been undisputed global reserve currency. Nearly 90% of international transactions are done in dollars. This gives America unparalleled control, the power to sanction, to pressure, to influence the economies of other nations without firing a single bullet. But BRICS wants to change that. The bloc has openly discussed creating a new global currency, backed by gold or commodities, to reduce dependence on the dollar. If successful, this could trigger a financial revolution. Oil, gas, and trade no longer priced in dollars means a decline in demand for US currency. And when the world stops needing the dollar, America loses its greatest weapon.
What's funny is that for the first time this year, we see signs of extreme FOMO in gold market. The incredible rally that we've seen so far in gold is ultimately a function of the fact that the US dollar is at least partly losing its store of value function. But what's interesting is that the last piece of this rally has really been quite different than what we've seen over the last several years, over the course of this bull market. It's different because China is notably absent from the ongoing rally, because for the first time in many months, macro funds are no longer underpositioned in gold. Algorithmic funds are holding their largest position size. Retail participation is at a decade high. We see signs of extreme FOMO here.
So for Washington, this isn't just economics, it's survival. To counter this growing threat, the US has turned to familiar tools like tariffs, sanctions, and political pressure. Nations like India have been repeatedly warned for buying Russian oil. China faces constant scrutiny over trade practices and technology exports. Even Brazil and South Africa have faced subtle diplomatic pressure to distance themselves from Moscow and Beijing. The US has long used its financial might to enforce its geopolitical will, but BRICS has started to erode that leverage by trading in local currencies, by creating development banks, and by bypassing the SWIFT system dominated by Western institutions. Each of these steps chips away at Americans' control of the global financial structure, something Washington cannot ignore. In an attempt to strike back, President Donald Trump introduced sweeping tariffs, 10% on all BRICS nations. On the surface, it looked like an economic policy, but in reality, it was a geopolitical signal. Trump's administration saw BRICS unity as a direct threat to US economy and the dollar's global role. By taxing imports, Washington aimed to disrupt the bloc's growth and discourage internal trade cooperation. But this move only strengthened BRICS' resolve. Nations have began doubling down on self-reliance, trade in native currencies, and joint ventures independent of the Western system. In trying to isolate BRICS, America may have accelerated its own isolation. As the US continues to confront rising inflation, internal polarization, and waning trust in its leadership, BRICS stands as a mirror, reflecting what the world could look like without a single nation calling the shots. The bloc is not perfect, internal divisions exist, and unity among 5 diverse nations is difficult. But what's undeniable is their shared vision, a future where global influence is distributed, not dictated. From Asia to Africa, from Latin America to the Middle East, more nations are turning their gaze eastward, seeking alternatives to the dollar, the IMF, and US military protection. For the first time in a century, the idea of a world beyond American control feels not just possible, but inevitable. Hence, the age of Western dominance is fading, and what replaces it will definitely redefine the future of a global power. Russia, India, and China stand at the crossroads of a changing world. Individually, they represent power. Together, they could redefine global politics. For years, today, Russia, India, and China share one thing in common: pressure from the West. Sanctions, tariffs, diplomatic isolation. Russia, cut off from Western markets after the war in Ukraine, now turns east for survival and opportunity. China, locked in a trade war with the United States, faces relentless scrutiny over technology exports and currency manipulation. And India, though maintaining relations with Washington, increasingly feels the sting of Western double standards. Criticized for neutrality, threatened with tariffs, and quoted only when convenient. This shared experience has ignited a quiet understanding that the Western order no longer guarantees stability but dependency, and to escape that web, cooperation is no longer optional. It's necessary. When the West weaponized its economic system, freezing assets, cutting banking access, and sanctioning industries, it sent a message to the world: control the dollar, control the system. Russia, India, and China read that message loud and clear. For Moscow, survival depends on bypassing sanctions and finding reliable partners. For Beijing, it's about defending its rise without being strangled by Western containment. And for New Delhi, it's about preserving independence, the freedom to trade, to act, and to choose its own path. The RIC mechanism offers exactly that, a platform to resist coercion, building parallel systems, and reshape how global rules are made. In other words, RIC isn't just about unity, it's about leverage. At its core, RIC revives an old idea, the dream of a multipolar world. A world where power isn't concentrated in USA or Brussels, but shared among emerging civilizations, where each nation has an agency and no country dictates the fate of others. For Russia and China, this means dismantling the unipolar dominance of the West. For India, it means walking a line of autonomy, refusing to be trapped in the binary of East versus West. And for all three, it means something more profound, the chance to restore balance to an international order long titled, long tilted in favor of one side. In a time when global institutions bend to Western influence, RIC represents the possibility of genuine equality in global governance, a system where decisions are shaped not by pressure but by partnership. Energy has become the lifeline connecting the three. With the West shutting its doors, Russia's oil and gas exports have found new homes in Indian refineries and Chinese industries. Both India and China have become Russia's largest energy customers, creating an economic triangle of mutual benefit. But beyond trade lies strategy. These nations are developing alternative payment mechanisms, bypassing the dollar, experimenting with local currencies, and even exploring gold-backed systems to settle transactions. They are coordinating logistics, sharing maritime routes, and insulating themselves from Western price caps. In effect, they are building a parallel energy ecosystem, one where Washington's approval no longer decides who can buy, sell, or survive. It's not merely about oil or gas, it's about independence, economic sovereignty, and that makes this bond stronger than any signed treaty. For decades, border tensions between India and China stood as the biggest obstacle to RIC success. Skirmishes, mistrust, and political rhetoric threatened to collapse the framework altogether, but times are changing. Quiet diplomacy has replaced loud confrontation. Both sides have begun de-escalation talks, reopened communication channels, and restored limited trade confidence. Why? Because both understand that conflict only serves one side, the West. A divided Asia benefits the Atlantic powers. A united Asia reshapes the world. This realization, however subtle, has started to rewrite strategic thinking in New Delhi and Beijing alike. For India, peace with China doesn't mean submission, it means balance. And for China, respecting India's sovereignty means partnership, not rivalry. The RIC dialogue is slowly becoming the table where such balance is negotiated. The timing wouldn't be more perfect. As Western economies grapple with inflation, political division, and global fatigue, the East is rising with renewed momentum. Russia offers resources and military power, China provides manufacturing might and financial systems. India brings technology, human capital, and democratic credibility. Together, they represent nearly 40% of the world's population and a quarter of its GDP. This isn't symbolic alliance anymore. It's a strategic one, capable of challenging US-centric narratives across trade, security, and development. If RIC can maintain unity despite ideological and territorial differences, it could form the foundation for something even larger, an Asian-led world order. See, RIC is not an anti-Western club. It's an anti-monopoly movement. It challenges the idea that progress and power must flow through one corridor, one currency, or one culture. It signals that cooperation between Asian civilizations can shape modern realities. That strength no longer comes from isolation, but integration, not through dominance, but through balance. As BRICS expands, and new alliances emerge, RIC could act at a strategic core, the brain of a larger movement that seeks to rebalance global power. From energy to economics, from defense to diplomacy, RIC offers a blueprint for coexistence in a multipolar world. In a time when the West is divided and distracted, the East is calculating and cautious, building not boasting. Russia, India, and China, three nations with centuries of rivalry, now find themselves bound by shared interests, shared challenges, and a shared opportunity. The question is no longer whether RIC can rise, but whether the world is ready for it. Because if these three powers align politically, economically, and strategically, the balance of global power will shift permanently. And once it does, the old order will never return. The world is watching, and history once again begins in the East. For nearly a century, the world has moved to the rhythm of the dollar, a single note echoing through every market, every trade, every debt. But what happens when three powers, Russia, India, and China, decide to compose their own symphony? What if the East creates its own currency, a financial weapon strong enough to rewrite the rules of global trade, challenge the petrodollar, and America's monopoly over money itself? To understand what this would mean, we first need to grasp the idea of de-dollarization, the slow, deliberate process of reducing dependence on the US dollar. If the RIC nations form a joint currency, it wouldn't be backed by political promises, but by real assets: oil, gas, rare earth minerals, and perhaps even gold. A commodity-backed system, resilient against inflation, immune to Western sanctions. Russia supplies energy, China dominates global manufacturing and rare metal processing. India controls one of the fastest growing service economies on earth. Together, their combined reserves could anchor a new monetary foundation. Imagine a world where oil from Russia, technology from China, and pharmaceuticals from India are all traded in a single RIC currency, not the dollar. That would fracture the foundation of the petrodollar system, the bedrock upon which US global dominance was built. For decades, oil and gas have been priced in dollars, forcing nations to stockpile dollars to buy energy. The system created artificial demand for the greenback and financed America's endless borrowing. A new RIC currency would end that cycle by pegging its value to a basket of commodities. The bloc could create what analysts call a commodity standard. Oil, natural gas, gold, lithium, all could contribute to the currency's intrinsic value. As trade within Asia, Africa, and Latin America shifts to this new system, the dollar's dominance in commodity pricing would shrink, slowly at first, then suddenly. Every central bank in the world holds foreign exchange reserves, most of which are in US dollars, parked in treasury bonds, effectively funding America's deficits. But with a credible RIC currency, nations could diversify. Instead of lending to Washington, they could invest in the East. Even a 10% global shift away from US treasuries would shake the American economy, raising borrowing costs, weakening the dollar, and making debt harder to finance. For the first time, Washington's greatest advantage, the ability to print and borrow limitlessly, would face a true rival. Currency is power, but control over payment systems is the weapon that wields it. The West has SWIFT, a messaging network used to execute global transactions, but Russia already built SPFS, and China has CIPS, both designed to operate independently of Western infrastructure. A unified RIC currency would integrate these systems into one network, allowing nations under Western sanctions, Iran, Venezuela, even African and Asian economies, to trade freely. This new financial web could bypass Washington's reach entirely. In the world of money, that's not rebellion, that's revolution. For nearly 80 years, the world has functioned under a single monetary empire. But a multipolar currency system with several strong currencies sharing global trade could change that forever. First, stability through balance. If one currency falters, say during an American debt crisis or a Chinese slowdown, others can absorb the shock. No single nation could weaponize its currency or dictate global policy through sanctions and monetary manipulation. This redistribution of power could also democratize global finance. Developing countries would gain leverage, negotiating loans, trade, and debt on more equal terms. It's not just diversification, it's decolonization. Financial independence from a system built to favor the West. But balance doesn't come without chaos. A multipolar currency could unleash volatility. Without one dominant currency anchoring exchange rates, trade becomes riskier, investments more uncertain. Imagine a world where oil contracts swing between three currencies weekly. Businesses would face constant recalibration, governments constant anxiety. Without a clear lender of last resort like the Federal Reserve during crisis, global downturns could last longer, deeper, and hit harder. In essence, the world would gain freedom but lose stability. And in economics, those two rarely coexist. A shared currency could unite Asia's economies like never before. India's manufacturing and service sectors could integrate with China's production power and Russia's source wealth, forming a trade corridor that operates entirely outside the dollar system. Every shipment, every transaction, every contract settled in a RIC unit instead of the dollar. This would reshape global logistics. The West would no longer sit at the center of the world's economic web. Asia would. The RIC currency could also become a financial instrument, a way for developing nations to borrow without strings attached. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia could issue bonds denominated in the new currency, avoiding dollar dependency and Western political conditions. That means fewer IMF bailouts, fewer Western dictates, and more financial autonomy for the global south. For the RIC bloc, this would mean not just economic expansion, but influence, quite lasting and global. For all its promise, the RIC currency faces a fundamental problem. Three economies couldn't be more different. India's system is democratic, open, and market-driven. China, in contrast, runs a state-controlled economy with strict capital controls. Russia's model is a resource-dependent, volatile, and vulnerable to sanctions. Combining these into one monetary policy is like merging fire, water, and oil. Powerful but unstable. For India, sharing a currency means risking its autonomy. For China, it means losing control, and for Russia, it means trusting both. A tall order for three powers that rarely trust anyone. Global reserve currency must be freely tradable. Capital must move in and out without restriction. But China's economy depends on capital controls to maintain internal stability. It's not ready or willing to open its vaults completely. Without convertibility, no foreign nation would trust the currency enough to use it for reserves or contracts. That's not a technical hurdle, it's a philosophical one. For currency to exist, trust must exist first. And that remains RIC's biggest weakness. The India-China border remains tense with both sides maintaining troops and suspicion. Moscow acts as a mediator, but even it knows alliances built on convenience can crumble under pressure. India fears a currency dominated by Beijing's economic muscle. China, on the other hand, seeks a system that extends its influence, not equalizes it. And Russia, desperate for economic lifelines, would accept any framework that breaks its isolation, even if it means playing second fiddle. A shared currency requires shared sovereignty, and sovereignty is something none of three are ready to share. Every global reserve currency is built on trust, and that trust is anchored on safe assets. The US dollar thrives because treasury bonds are liquid, reliable, and deep enough for the world to park its wealth. RIC lacks such an instrument to replace the dollar. It must create a bond market equally stable, a financial backbone others can depend on. But can three governments with differing ideologies agree on fiscal rules, interest rates, and transparency? Without that, the new currency remains a symbol, not a system. The euro succeeded because it had the European Central Bank, one institution managing policy, rates, and inflation for all. RIC would have no such authority. Who decides the supply of money? Who adjusts the rate when inflation spikes? Who guarantees stability when crisis hits? Each of the three would want control. No one would surrender it. Without a central mechanism, the currency could splinter under its own weight before it ever reaches global circulation. Still, even the attempt to create such a currency would send shockwaves through the world economy. Confidence in the dollar would waver. Nations long silent about Western financial dominance would find courage. Gold prices would rise, US bond yields would climb. Global trade flows would reroute. Even if the RIC currency never fully materialized, the message alone would be enough to destabilize confidence in the American-led order. In geopolitics, perception is power, and perception can move markets faster than the policy. For decades, nations have believed that there was no alternative to the dollar, that global finance begins and ends in USA. The rise of a potential RIC currency breaks that illusion. It tells the world that power is no longer inherited, it's contested. Even the thought of a second reserve currency forces a diversification, weakens America's financial grip, and accelerates multipolarity. In that sense, the new currency doesn't need to succeed to change the world. It only needs to exist. Empires once ruled with armies. Today they rule with currencies. The United States built its empire not on conquest, but on credit. Not on land, but on liquidity. If RIC succeeds, that empire will finally meet its equal, not on battlefield, but in the marketplace. Of course, it won't happen overnight. It might take decades, but every new trade settled outside the dollar, every barrel of oil priced in another unit, every nation that diversifies its reserves marks one more crack in the old order. The world is moving slowly but surely toward balance, away from the monopoly of one and into the influence of many. And when the dust settles, the story of the 21st century will not be written in dollars, but in choices. Choices made by nations that dare to imagine a world where money like power belongs to all. This is not the end of America, but the end of its financial empire, the beginning of something new, something multipolar, something inevitable. Russia is hugely dependent on oil, but do you know who actually runs the oil empire? Not the politicians you see on screen, not the corporations with glittering towers. Behind every barrel, every price shift, and every so-called energy crisis lies a single network, silent, ancient, and astonishingly powerful. They don't need headlines, they own them. They don't chase influence, they manufacture it. From the Middle East to Wall Street, their reach defines who rises and who collapses. The true rulers of oil don't operate in boardrooms. They sit in private estates, dictating the pulse of global wealth and shaping wars, economies, even alliances like BRICS and NATO. You think oil made nations rich? No, it made a family untouchable. Next time we uncover the family behind the oil empire.